Okay, hi, welcome back to an in-depth summary of John Corder's book, The Power of Babel. Um, this is chapter 5, the thousands of dialects of thousands of languages, all developed far beyond the call of duty. And he's not talking about the video game. All right. When a language has been around for an extended and uninterrupted period of time, it starts to develop appendages. So, in the words of the author, quote, in any language on earth, the structure of the grammar and the subdivisions of meaning it can convey far overshoot what would be necessary to even rich and nuanced communication. Page 178. As an example, European languages, as well as English, tend to have a perfect tense. So, in the case of the present perfect, it is distinguished from, say, the simple past, in that it indicates that a complete past action still has present repercussions. Or at least that's one of the usages of the present perfect. Although a useful feature to have, it is ultimately non-essential, and a great many languages do not have it, functioning perfectly well without it. Context is often more than enough for the listener or reader to understand where in time an action or event lies. Needless to say, other languages also have this overgrowth that strikes English and other speakers as unnecessary. As McCorder explains, quote, the first language then split into thousands of branches that each have evolved in part to maintain what is necessary to communication, but in equal part have evolved just because various semantic spaces, perceivable to and processable by human cognition, but non-essential to the needs of speech, were there to be evolved into. Page 179. Right? This tendency, as mentioned, is inherent in all long-standing languages. Okay, this process happens at random. So English, for instance, does not distinguish between things when using the verb have, right? You have an arm and you have a table. Other languages, such as Spanish, explicitly mark these differences. This does not mean that English is backward or poor, simply that it did not head in this particular grammatical direction. Obviously, an English speaker knows, right, that there's a fundamental difference in the relationship between one's arm and a table. It's just that the language does not require explicit marking. There are other examples as well. In many European languages, reflexivity is more pervasive than in most other languages, including English. So English uses reflexivity mostly for emphasis, right? She told me herself that she's gotten married, or I myself will speak to the emperor, right? These sentences are grammatically and pragmatically sound without the reflexive pronouns. They're fine, right? Not so, say French, right, where you cannot merely say I slip, right, je glisse, but must instead say je me glisse, as in I myself have slipped. The reason for this in the mind of a French speaker is that, after all, you did not make someone else slip, right? In French, if one says je glisse, as in I slip, the listener or reader expects a whom or what to follow, right? Whom did you make slip, for instance? Another common distinction between heavyweight languages, those that have been around for a long while, is articles. Though English has 3, a and the. Russian has none. French has a great many, and Arabic has 1, roughly equivalent to the English the. So some languages get around this lack of articles by word order, where the order of words indicates whether or not something has been introduced. Other languages use their word for that when explicitness is required. Still others, like Arabic and Japanese, do not have articles for indefinite nouns, but do have one for definite ones. So the lack of an article indicates that it's indefinite, that the noun is indefinite. The last example that shows how randomly language change occurs is gender marking, right? Many languages make do without this feature, but many others require explicit marking of all nouns as either male, female. Some languages have neutral. And in the case of some languages, even more distinctions are necessary. What typically happens here is that a quintessential word for male or female becomes the basis upon which all others are based. So in Latin, to take an example, the word for woman, femina, ends in a, and so most a-ending words in the language were classified as female, with some exceptions. Obviously, this has survived to the modern age. Almost all names that end in a are female names, right? Maria, Carla, Lara, Sarah, right? And many others, I'm sure. At this point, it's probably tempting, as mentioned in a previous chapter, to attribute such changes to culture, right? Again, the same answer, the same kind of argument is given, that languages barely kilometers apart, right, stemming from similar cultures, or even cultures that are pretty much the same, often vary considerably. So this leads to the conclusion that language change is not only random, but isn't always necessary or beneficial, right? So just like evolution is not perfect, right? Our appendix, for instance, is useless, and if it gets infected, even harmful. Not every linguistic change serves a practical purpose, right? Sometimes a language takes on certain characteristics simply because it can. So to give a specific example, quote, gender and conjugational inflections develop not because they are needed, but through gradual creeping grammaticalization of what begin as separate words. Page 193. Most of these prefixes and suffixes that we've been talking about, like articles, okay, came to be as a result of the joining of two or more words. So what started out as amare habeo in Latin became amero in modern Italian. So note that some languages like Chinese do not have inflections, right? So what they do have, however, is tonality. So we're talking about more junk, if you will. Okay, the tone a word is uttered in changes its meaning. So like inflections, this type of language development is at best a useful tool for communication, but it is by no means an indispensable one. Of course, should Chinese lose its tonality, it would probably be close to incomprehensible. However, the point is that tonality was not its only option. It simply evolved in that direction. In fact, according to McWhorter, tonality, quote, can result only from a language that began without it. Page 197. If it began without it, it means it could have continued without it, right? Though it didn't. A few languages have neither inflections nor tones. However, this does not mean they are easy languages to learn. Okay, all this accretion of a language that we've been talking about, call it sludge, call it junk, wherever you'd like, is not equal across all languages. In other words, some languages are carrying more junk than others. As McWhorter claims, I quote, some languages are by chance more accreted than others. It is sometimes said that all languages are equally complex, but more properly, all languages are complex to some degree. Page 200. And he highlighted the last bit. He put it in italics to emphasize it. All languages are complex to some degree. Since we're addressing misconceptions, here's another one. So-called primitive societies often have simpler languages. Given that I've introduced it as a misconception, you have probably guessed what the truth is. It is, in fact, the opposite, right? These, let's call them non-urban societies, often have languages so complex that they baffle the average speaker from an urban society. This may seem surprising at first, but it isn't upon further inspection. As McWhorter explains, I quote, languages that have submitted to a great deal of second language learning, right, English, something inherent to a language is becoming geopolitically dominant, like English, are hindered from developing as much as are hindered from developing as much such frippery by the slight pigeonization that adult learning enforces. Page 202. What this basically means is that a ubiquitous language, like English, remains relatively straightforward since non-natives are constantly learning it, right? It would not be in the best interest of English to be constantly and randomly changing. But with a language like Welsh, spoken almost exclusively by native speakers, junk tends to gather in greater number. So the author gives a great analogy to explain this. Think of a small office, right, where the same people have been working for several years. In time, they begin to develop, if not their own language, their own references, right, their own inside jokes. So they often start alluding to things that only they can understand, right, based on their experiences together, based on the people that they dislike at the office, annoying customers, whatever. right? This is Welsh, right? This is the equivalent of Welsh. English, in our example, would be akin to a large corporation, right? Where this development is unlikely, given how separated employees tend to be. They usually have fewer contact time together, and they're often so overworked that an internal lingo will most likely not happen. One of the most complex languages in the world, at least in the eyes of an outsider, is an African language called Fula. Probably mispronouncing it, perhaps mispronouncing it. Okay, Fula, not sure. Because speakers of Fula usually only communicate with other speakers of Fula, the language has become quite random and complex. So we can conclude then that, quote, if sociohistory thrusts a previously isolated language into a more interethnically dominant role, most likely the language will be simplified a tad over the generations. Page 204. Makes sense. I have mentioned that languages that have been around for millennia tend to have unnecessary features, which suggests that some languages don't. What are they? Well, the short answer is creoles. I quote, creoles are usually born again from pidgins. Recall that pidgins develop when adults needing to learn and use a language quickly for passing, utilitarian purposes, strip it down to its bare bones, eschewing almost everything that is not strictly necessary to communicating. This process naturally means that most or all inflections have to go. Page 206. Looked at another way, creoles walk that fine line between a rudimentary pidgin and a complex language. They can convey nuanced meaning, but are not burdened with a plethora of irregularities like millennia-old languages. Another tendency that old languages have is hard to trace prefixes or suffixes coupled with a root word. For instance, understatement makes sense. But what about understand? Why is standing under something a mark of comprehension, right? So this linguistic inclination, quote, is essentially as inevitable as the fact that iron will rust. For in time, a language will have developed semantically messy prefix-suffix plus root combinations. Page 209. This is yet another sign that a language is millennia old. Changes like this, where understand has ceased to have meaning for a native speaker when broken down, can only happen through slow incremental changes that occur over many, many generations. A Creole like Tok Pisin, for example, hasn't been around for 200 years, and as a Creole, it has existed for even less than that. So such an abrupt change like understand would be unlikely to make it into Tok Pisin. For now, at least, Tok Pisin's prefixes and suffixes behave in predictable ways. But if it survives as a language, this will most likely not be the case in, say, 1,000 years. Therefore, I quote, any language in the world that has no inflections, tone to distinguish words or express grammatical features, or semantically unpredictable prefix/suffix plus root combinations is a Creole. Page 211. Note, however, that even a Creole, once it passes the 1 or 2 year mark, will display some junk. So speakers of Creoles often always mark tenses, whereas ancient languages and some modern ones only do so when context is insufficient to understanding. Also, Creoles typically have definite and or indefinite articles, another linguistic feature that is useful but unnecessary. Therefore, even Creoles are not as stripped down as one may be led to believe. With that comes the end of chapter 5.